This is BBC News. I'm Christian Fraser, live in Brussels as Boris Johnson and the European Union announced they have reached a Brexit deal. Mr Johnson says it's a great deal, which takes back control. The EU describes the deal as a fair and balanced agreement.
For us in the UK, it means that we can deliver a real Brexit that achieves our objectives, and it means that the UK leaves whole and entire on October the 31st.
But the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, rules out granting any further extensions.
We have a deal, so why should we have a prorogation?
But can Mr Johnson get his deal through Parliament on Saturday? Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionists say they still can't support it as things stand. And the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, calls it a sellout deal. He wants the people to have the final say in another referendum.
As it stands, we cannot support this deal and will oppose it in Parliament on Saturday. And it also is unclear if he has the support of his allies in the DUP or indeed many of his allies on his own backbenches.
We'll bring you all the latest from here in Brussels and also from Westminster. Hello, good afternoon and welcome to Brussels. The Prime Minister says the UK and the EU have struck a great new deal on Brexit. Speaking in Brussels just a few hours ago, Boris Johnson called the agreement a reasonable, fair outcome and said now is the moment to get Brexit done. The President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, said he was happy with the deal and he wouldn't support a further extension if one was requested. But Mr Johnson still faces a huge battle to get the deal through Parliament on Saturday, which is to hold a special one-day sitting. The DUP, which supports the Conservatives in Parliament, has said it will vote against the proposals, and the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, said today it was a worse deal than Theresa May's. So what actually is in this new agreement? Well, let's take a look at it in a bit more detail. First, to avoid a hard border, Northern Ireland will remain aligned to a set of rules related to the EU's single market. Northern Ireland remains a part of the UK customs territory, but by avoiding a customs border on the island of Ireland, there will be a de facto border for goods down the Irish Sea. A controversial backstop has been removed. And members of the Northern Irish Assembly will now have a say on the long-term application of EU law in Northern Ireland, but any decision would be based on a simple majority. Well, the Prime Minister held a news conference after arriving here in Brussels, saying that he hoped MPs would now push ahead with passing what he describes as a good deal.
This deal represents a very good deal both for the EU and for the UK, and it's a reasonable, fair outcome and reflects the large amount of work that's been undertaken by both sides. And I agree very much, Jean-Claude, with what you said about protecting the peace process in the island of Ireland and in Northern Ireland. And of course, for us in the UK, it means that we can deliver a real Brexit that achieves our objectives, and it means that the UK leaves whole and entire on October the 31st, and it means that Northern Ireland and every other part of the UK can take part not just in free trade deals, offering our tariffs, exporting our goods around the world, but it also means that we can take together as a single, united kingdom, decisions about our future, about our laws, our borders, our money, and how we want to run the UK.
Boris Johnson speaking just a few hours ago. Well, the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, spoke to reporters about this deal. He said there could not be another extension to the Brexit deadline.
happens if this doesn't pass through Parliament?
I'm not in charge of the parliamentary ratification in Britain. That's the job of Boris.
But do you believe that it will?
I hope it will. I'm convinced it will. But it has to.
It has to, but if it doesn't?
Anyway, there will be no prolongation.
There will be no prolongation, no delay?
Could there be an extension, Mr. Minister?
We have concluded the deal, and so there is not an argument for further delay. It has to be done now.
Jean-Claude Juncker, the European Commission President, saying there'd be no further delay. But remember, it is in the power of the 27 EU leaders whether or not there would be a further extension if one was requested. But the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland has said they won't be supporting the new agreement in Parliament on Saturday, and here's why. They released a statement saying these proposals are not, in our view, beneficial to the economic well-being of Northern Ireland, and they undermine the integrity of the Union. Our main route of trade on an east-west basis, they say, will be subject to rules of the European Union Customs Union, notwithstanding that Northern Ireland will remain part of the UK customs territory. And they go on to say that throughout all the discussions on these issues, we have been clear that Northern Ireland should not be subjected to administrative burdens which will be entrenched for the future. So, a lot of focus then on the DUP's position this afternoon. Let's go to our political correspondent Vicky Young, who is in Central Lobby for us. And we're starting to hear from all the other parties in Northern Ireland, Vicky, much more in favour of the deal than the DUP, although they've got some reservations about what is contained within it.
Yeah, I mean, and that has always been the dynamic, hasn't it, that Northern Ireland did vote to stay in the European Union, and yet the DUP, of course, very much on the side of Brexit. But, you know, it turns out they're not willing to accept any deal. They're looking very closely at it. Let's discuss this with a person who knows all about this, the former Northern Ireland Secretary, James Brokenshire, who is with me now. The DUP are saying that this deal undermines the integrity of the United Kingdom.
I think that everyone needs to look closely at what the deal says, and Northern Ireland very firmly remaining within the UK customs union, customs area, so benefiting from the free trade agreements that we would want to see post the deal coming into effect. And I think it is important to stress that. Equally important to stress the principles of consent that are very much emboldened into the agreement that has been struck with the EU. And I hope that on that reflection that there will be that careful consideration by the DUP and others to see that we do get behind this deal, to see that on Saturday a vote is passed here in Parliament to get it over the line so that we can put all of this, almost all of this pain, all of this real turmoil that we've been through as a country over the last number of years behind us and be able to move forward.
Are you surprised that Boris Johnson managed to get a deal, given how much we'd heard from the EU about not reopening the withdrawal agreement, not removing the backstop? Are you surprised that this has happened?
It's interesting because I backed Boris Johnson in the leadership because I felt he was the right person to get a deal and to carry it through Parliament. And obviously now, yes, all those things that we were told were impossible. But Boris has achieved that, reopening the withdrawal agreement and actually being able to get this deal with the EU now. But clearly the next challenge is in passing the vote here in Parliament, and that's where all of the focus lies. I want to see MPs now getting behind this. This, I think, reflects, yes, the unique circumstances of Northern Ireland, upholding the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, recognising the way in which business operates north-south across the island of Ireland, and therefore how this is very firmly reflected into this deal.
The DUP also say that there are going to be administrative burdens for businesses in Northern Ireland, which won't be the same for other companies elsewhere in the UK, and they will be being treated very differently to the rest of GB.
Well, there's no doubt that we have a unique situation in Northern Ireland and on the island of Ireland, reflective in the constitutional and other settlement that we have there. And so I think it, yes, is about looking at the detail of this, and the agreement itself recognises that there is still more detail that needs to be fleshed out, and that will now take place post the, obviously as I would want to see, the passing of the agreement and actually seeing this moving forward. But I think that you can look at this on how Northern Ireland businesses are able to operate. Actually having the benefit of the free trade agreements, but also that ability to trade within the island of Ireland without the burdens of bureaucracy. There's a regulation zone that now will operate, and equally without some of those issues in relation to customs too. So I think there are positive things that you can look at in terms of business in Northern Ireland, but equally seeing this is underpinned by the principle of consent and the requirement of a vote at Stormont in order to see that this continues, recognising that this is different and recognising that there is this application of rules that wouldn't operate otherwise.
Okay, James Brokenshire, thank you very much indeed. The question is whether Boris Johnson would have the numbers without the DUP, but I think important to say that Downing Street and others are making it clear that the talks with the DUP are not over. They have been in constant contact and they still will continue to be so.
Vicky, for the moment, thank you very much. We're going to pick up some of those issues on Ireland in the company of the MEP and Vice President of the European Parliament, Mairead McGuinness. It's very good to see you. Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. Let's just pick up on what James Brokenshire was saying there, that he views this deal as upholding the principles of the Belfast Agreement. Do you?
Yes, and I think that was the absolute core of all of this delay, that we needed to make sure that there was no disruption to the Good Friday Agreement, to the all-island economy, to our principle of no hard infrastructure, no checks on the island of Ireland. And I think that has been achieved in this agreement. I suppose in the corridors here in the European Parliament, people are trying to analyse and parse as to how it will be implemented. But I think it is an important day, a relatively sad day, I have to say, but it is now moving more certain towards that the UK will leave the European Union. I'm saying that without understanding fully the numbers in the House of Commons, but for the details around Ireland, I think it was absolutely pivotal that there was an awareness of the special and unique position of Northern Ireland, and I appreciate that that was well understood at the EU side, and that the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, indeed in his comments, reflected that. So I think for Northern Ireland, for business, for farming, they will want to see how this will be applied, but I think it is an important aspect of the withdrawal agreement, as indeed is the principle that Stormont will be able to vote within 4 years when this is implemented, and that a simple majority will hold sway. And I think that's also important, and there are other aspects to that, if you like, verification of the deal. I think in this House we're trying to look at our own timetable. We will be watching carefully what's happening in the House of Commons on Saturday, and we're trying to understand the various commentaries, the ongoing negotiations with the DUP, and perhaps we may be required next week to verify and ratify this withdrawal agreement. So there is much to discuss here in the European Parliament.
I want to come back to that ratification and the timing of it in a second, but I just want to ask you about the DUP's position and a furious row that there is on social media at the moment about whether they do have consent. I mean, initially in the first Boris Johnson offer, they had their own veto, and since then what they've been pushing for is a majority community veto, if you will, so a majority of unionists and a majority of nationalists. But if I'm right, Mairead, the European Parliament was never going to give the DUP their own veto on this.
Well, I think the DUP, by their statements today, are looking for a veto, and I think it would be unthinkable for any party in Northern Ireland to have a veto over a withdrawal agreement that has been negotiated between the European Union and the United Kingdom, which is trying to limit the damage, because frankly today is not a good day. I believe that we will all lose out because of Brexit, the UK and the European Union, and what this agreement is trying to do is limit the damage. So it would be unthinkable that any party in Northern Ireland or elsewhere would have a veto. And I think it's very important to understand the principle of consent, and that word is being used. We have to look at, first of all, Stormont is not sitting. We would hope that it would, but it would only be right and proper that a vote of all of the parties in Stormont and the outcome of that vote would be reflected in their view of staying within this arrangement or wanting to leave it. I don't think it would be proper that one party could decide what happens next, and I think that Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, is obviously in agreement on that he doesn't see a veto as being appropriate. There is a huge difference between a Parliament giving its support by a majority vote than allowing one party, because of its say-so, saying no. I mean, I don't think anyone would regard that as appropriate.
Mairead McGuinness, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you very much indeed for your company this afternoon. Well, let's speak to the Italian MEP, Marco Campomanossi. He's from the Identity and Democracy Group. Marco, it's very good to have you with us. Of course, you're aligned to the Lega Party in Italy. So how do you see this deal? Do you think it's a good deal for Boris Johnson?
Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Yeah, I think it's a good deal for for your Prime Minister, because I think that finally we have reached something concrete, because the European institutions have lost a lot of time in these 2 years, because they wanted to have against your country a sort of punitive approach. No? So their first aim was to teach all the other countries in order to say, hey, don't do as our British friends because it's very negative. Now, if Mr. Johnson will reach the target, so to have a Brexit in a fast way, in a good way, and especially if the United Kingdom will have a growth in the coming years, then there will be problems for the European institutions, because their first aim used to be against your country, to have a punitive approach. But they have maybe understood that closing and negotiate before elections was better, because after, in case you are having early elections, Mr. Johnson would be even stronger than now.
Well, it's interesting that you put it in that way as a European, because, I mean, the European Union would probably say what they're trying to do here is protect the integrity of their single market, so that things don't come into Italian consumers that have not, that don't uphold European checks and balances. And also what they don't want, in their view, is the UK to be undercutting regulations, reducing taxes, so that there is too much competition from the UK to the likes of Italy. So I'm surprised that you don't want those sort of assurances.
No, but we are happy, because we need clarity, because Italy, but also France and Germany are exporters. They export goods towards the United Kingdom, and they needed an agreement, because for a lot of period during these 2 years, the European institutions did not care about this aspect. They prefer to say silly things about the fact that Italians living in UK would have had problems, which is not true, which is absolutely not true, which is absolutely not a pain for us. But what is important for our producers is to have good agreements, because Great Britain is too much important. For example, for Italy, my country, we have good agreements in the defense industry with Leonardo, our state enterprise on this sector, and many other things. Because if United Kingdom will have a free trade agreement with the United States, with Canada, with Australia, with New Zealand, this would be a problem for the European producers. So for this reason we needed an agreement. So I know very well that there are internal questions, the Irish question. I don't know what will happen. I will be an interested observer about what will happen. But in my country, we want that democracy is respected, and democracy says that United Kingdom citizens are asked to go out of from this European Union.
Very interesting perspectives. Marco Campomanossi, thank you very much for being with us. Let's go back to Westminster and speak to our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young, who's been getting a reaction for us. Are you getting any sort of steer, Vicky, on which way this vote might go on Saturday?
No, I mean, I think it is guesswork for most people at the moment. I mean, all sorts of stories about people changing their minds or deciding they will back this deal, having not backed Theresa May's deal. But let's get the perspective from the Liberal Democrats and one of their newest, if not the newest MP, Sam Gyimah, who is with me, former Conservative, of course. Boris Johnson has done what everyone said he didn't want to do. He hasn't gone for no deal. He's gone for a deal. He's managed to get the withdrawal agreement reopened. And he's managed to get the backstop changed. Is there anything that would make you vote for this deal?
Absolutely not. I think you're overstating Boris Johnson's achievement here. I mean, this was a deal that Theresa May rejected. Theresa May, who Boris Johnson said was too weak, rejected it, and now he signed up to an embellished version of that deal. When the Northern Ireland backstop was first floated, Boris himself described it as an outrageous infringement on the UK's integrity. Today, he wants us to welcome it as a masterstroke. In fact, all it is a deal that Theresa May rejected with a blonde wig on it. So let's not give him too much credit for what has happened today. I will not vote for it, and the reason why I will not vote for it is firstly, it's one country, two systems. There was no mandate in the referendum to break up the UK, and this essentially does that, which is why the DUP can't support it.
I mean, some would say it's not the same as Theresa May's original proposal because there is this element of consent written into it.
Well, I said it's embellished. So yes, it's got the element of consent, but clearly the DUP do not find it satisfactory. Otherwise, they will be signing up to it. And if Boris Johnson is really into consent and given us a vote on these things, then I would say, why doesn't he subject his deal to a confirmatory referendum? It would fly through the Commons and let the people of this country decide whether this really is the future that they want.
Now, is that going to be the tactic on Saturday? Because there's a lot of chat that actually Saturday is not the right time to try and get another referendum for various reasons, partly because you're not sure you've got the numbers.
I think the issue is not the numbers. I think it's people are obviously thinking about what motion is Boris actually going to present? Is it amendable? And if so, is Saturday the right time? I think we do have the difficulty that we've got very limited time in terms of the debate. We had 5 days of debate with Theresa May's thing. We're going to have 5 hours on Saturday. So there are lots of considerations, but we will be looking to bring forward some kind of confirmatory referendum on his deal at the earliest possible opportunity.
Okay, Sanjima, thank you very much indeed. Now, the fear amongst some is that by doing it on Saturday, that might get defeated, that notion of another referendum, and then that would be the end of it if the deal were to get through. The other thing they're looking at is possibly trying to change the withdrawal agreement bill, which would come later, and try to get a referendum inserted at that point.
Yeah, very interesting. And just to reiterate that from this side, the European Parliament and the European Council said they won't ratify this agreement until they see what happens there on Saturday. Vicky, thank you very much for the moment. Let's speak to Colin Eastwood. He's leader of the Social Democratic and Labour Party, known as the SDLP in Northern Ireland, and he's in Londonderry Forest. Colin, it's good to have you with us. We keep talking about this consent mechanism. It, of course, depends on getting Stormont up and running again. Is there any prospect of that?
Well, exactly. We haven't had institutions here in 3 years, and I'm not sure how likely it's going to be that we'll get them back anytime soon. But we need to get them back, not just because of this, but because not having a government is having a real impact on our health service, on our economy, and our schools. So that's something we're working very hard on. It's the DUP and Sinn Féin, who are the largest two parties there, haven't been able to get it together, and we've all suffered because of it. But none of us asked for the Assembly to be kind of thrust into the middle of the trading relationship between the North of Ireland and the UK, and the North of Ireland and the European Union. We didn't expect that. We think it's one of the weaker parts of the deal, in fact, but we're glad that it doesn't have a veto mechanism for the DUP, which the whole thing would have been absolutely pointless if we had secured an agreement between the UK government and the European Union, and then allowed the DUP, who are a minority party in Northern Ireland, to veto it. So I'm glad that that's been taken out. I do think there are difficulties with the kind of rolling consent issue. And it creates some instability where we don't need any more instability. But in the round, this deal, I suppose, isn't as good as remaining in the EU. It isn't as good as the backstop, which of course the DUP and others rejected. But it is better than no deal, and it does protect us from a hard border on this island. And I think that's because the European Union, the Irish government, have worked very hard to ensure that. But it is not an ideal position for us. We'd much prefer to be staying in the European Union. But the antics of people like the DUP have kind of forced us into this situation where we have to have a clunky response to what could have been a much simpler solution.
I hear you, and I'm guessing, since you and your party would vote Remain, that you would always uphold the agreement if it came to this rolling vote. If just explain for us, because you said that this creates some instability. We should explain to people there would be a consent mechanism which kicked in after 4 years, and then another 4 years would go by and there would be consent again. So you're saying that would really divide Northern Ireland every 4 years?
Well, it would. I think the result would be pretty inevitable in that the majority of people in Northern Ireland, and therefore the majority of the representatives of the people of Northern Ireland, want to remain in the European Union, never mind just the customs union, or the customs arrangements at least, and the single market. So I think the result would be inevitable. It is difficult though for businesses who are trying to plan beyond 4 years, and it's very rare you'll be getting finance for a major investment for over a 4-year period. That will become a difficulty. We recognise that and we worry about that, and we don't need any more instability, but it is and I never supported the idea that the Assembly should be involved at all, but if it has to be involved, it's better than what clearly the DUP were looking for, which would have been a veto for them, which would have just been anti-democratic and very dangerous.
Colin Eastwood, really interesting to hear your thoughts. Thank you very much for joining us from Londonderry. So just to remind you that Boris Johnson at the moment is with the other 27 leaders. They are talking about Brexit. It's the first thing on the agenda this afternoon. We will bring you all the details of that as and when we get it.
Hello there. It's something of a northwest-southeast split to the weather forecast across Europe over the next few days. We've got low pressure approaching from the Atlantic. You can see the swirling cloud on the satellite image. That's bringing some showery, unsettled weather across the northwestern half of Europe, whereas further south and east, clearer skies here and drier, warmer conditions holding on into the weekend. So plenty of heavy showers across the UK, France, up towards Scandinavia too. But actually temperatures across the Balkans, in some places about 10 degrees above average. Plenty of sunny weather for Greece, into Italy too, but we could see some heavy showers for Italy later on into next week. Much of Spain looking largely dry and settled. We've got some rain pushing into northwestern parts of Portugal and some showery weather sitting across parts of France into Germany and Denmark as well. Pretty chilly though for northern parts of Scandinavia. Into Saturday, no great changes. That weather, the showery weather, just pushes a little bit further southwards and eastwards. So we're seeing some heavy rain pushing into parts of Spain, Italy as well. But again, much of Romania, Ukraine, towards Greece and Turkey looks pretty warm and dry too. So the outlook over the next 5 days or so, less unsettled than it has been in London. So fewer showers here. Still a few showers though for Paris and Madrid, but Rome looking mostly dry with some sunshine on offer. Sunny spells too for Berlin over the next 5 days or so. Some outbreaks of rain in Moscow. Bye-bye.
I'm Catty Kane, Washington.
I'm Christian Fraser in London.
Let's start with
The European Union. Brexit.
Russian interference.
Donald Trump's Twitter feed.
We'll
move on.
I think there are going to be a lot of questions now.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be fascinating to watch.
We're nearly out of time.
This is a big deal.
Beyond 100 Days on BBC World News.
Come and listen to my story about a man named Jed. A poor mountaineer barely kept his family fed. And then one day he was shooting at some food, and up through the ground come a bubbling crude. Black gold, Texas tea. Well, the first thing you know, old Jed's a millionaire. The kinfolk said, Jed, move away from there. Said, California is the place you ought to be. So they loaded up the truck and they moved to Beverly.
Opportunity. What we deliver by delivering.
From the stars who made it onto the red carpet, we also look at the festival's smaller, vibrant offerings. British pictures made on a shoestring. Join me, Tom Brooke, for Talking Movies on BBC World News.
This is BBC World News. I'm Matthew Amrodiwala. Our top stories. A deal is done. Boris Johnson and the European Union have announced they have reached an agreement on Brexit.
For us in the UK, it means that we can deliver a real Brexit that achieves our objectives. And it means that the UK leaves whole and entire on October the 31st.
Boris Johnson now needs to get his deal through Parliament on Saturday. His coalition partners, Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionists, say they still can't support it as things stand. The President of the EU Commission warns there won't be another Brexit extension.
If we have a deal, we have a deal, and there is no need for prolongation. That's not only the British view, that's my view too.
One other headline here, grim faces as the US Vice President meets Turkey's leader to push for an immediate end of the military offensive in Syria. Hello and welcome to BBC World News. We have a deal. That's the message from Brussels, where British and EU negotiators have reached an agreement on Britain's withdrawal from the European Union. It comes after days of intensive negotiations ahead of that crucial summit of EU leaders. Well, let's head live to Brussels and live to Christian Fraser. And Christian, they're over the line, or certainly one of the lines.
Over one of the lines, yes, a major hurdle overcome early this morning. I think came as a surprise to many people here in Brussels because it had gone late through the night, the negotiation, and there were still some tricky issues, notably customs, VAT, and these level playing field mechanisms. How do they keep the UK on the same sort of regulations and taxes as the rest of the European Union? So all those things will be thrashed out into the future, but for the moment, don't forget we're talking about the divorce part of the agreement, the withdrawal agreement. That seems to have come to a satisfactory closure, if you will, for both sides. There have been changes to the agreement, of course, the backstop, which has caused so many problems in this negotiation, how to keep the border open between Northern Ireland and the Republic. That has been removed, and in its place we've got this dual customs partnership. I should just explain where I am, because this is the European media that is massed behind me preparing for their evening bulletins, and once that news came through that an agreement had been hammered out this morning, there was great excitement here, but very quickly after that we got a statement from the Democratic Unionist Party, the main unionist party in Northern Ireland, saying it wasn't a deal that they could accept because it established a customs border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and for them, in the words of Arlene Foster, their leader, that was a blood red line. So what does that mean when it comes to that crucial vote in the House of Commons on Saturday? Well, effectively it takes away 10 votes from the Conservative side, from Boris Johnson. So a lot of people here asking tonight, well, yeah, we've got a deal, but can he get it through the House of Parliament? Can he ratify it? Don't forget, it went down 3 times when Theresa May put that deal to the House of Commons. This is what the Prime Minister had to say just a couple of hours ago.
I do think that this deal represents a very good deal both for the EU and for the UK, and it's a reasonable, fair outcome and reflects the large amount of work that's been undertaken by both sides. And I agree very much, Jean-Claude, with what you said about protecting the peace process in the island of Ireland and in Northern Ireland. And of course, for us in the UK, it means that we can deliver a real Brexit that achieves our objectives. And it means that the UK leaves whole and entire on October the 31st. And
fascinating reaction this afternoon when the Prime Minister went into the meeting room to sit with the other 27 leaders. Of course, it is his first time here in Brussels as the Prime Minister sitting in the round, and there was a lot of backslapping and high fives, but I couldn't help but detect maybe a sense of relief in the room as well, because at the outset of this negotiation, Boris Johnson had been setting down some fairly stiff red lines, and of course he's been committed to that do or die pledge that the UK would be leaving on October the 31st, and that has implications, of course, for all these leaders in the room, no deal would be damaging for the UK, but equally so for Ireland, for France, for the Netherlands in particular, but also many other countries in the European Union. So there was some happy faces in the building this afternoon, and Boris Johnson certainly got quite a warm welcome. So what did Jean-Claude Juncker, the European Commission President, the outgoing Commission President, make of it all? This is what he said a little earlier.
We have a deal. And this deal means that there is no need for any kind of prolongation. And this is a fair, a balanced agreement. It is testament to our commitment to finding solutions. It provides certainty where Brexit creates uncertainty. It protects the rights of our citizens, and it protects peace and stability on the island of Ireland.
A lot of people here scratching their heads as to what the Commission President was saying there. Is he saying no other extension? In which case that would really focus minds in the Parliament in London on Saturday, because they'd either be voting on that deal or no deal at all if there's no further extension. So that would certainly focus minds. Or was he saying, well, look, we don't need to talk about extensions because we have a deal. Let's talk about the deal. A lot of people looking at it in two different ways. The man who is crucial, though, right at the centre of all this, or has been in the last week, is, of course, Michel Barnier. This is what he had to say about the deal.
The UK government has wanted to open one point in the withdrawal agreement, a key point, the question of the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland. Throughout these negotiations, the EU and the UK were fully committed to protect peace, to protect stability on the island of Ireland. We had to reconcile two objectives. First, include a legally operative solution in the withdrawal agreement that would avoid a hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, preserve the whole island economy and protect the integrity of the single market. Secondly, a point extremely important to Prime Minister Johnson and the UK was that Northern Ireland remains in the UK's customs territory. Discussions over the past days have at times been difficult, but we have delivered, and we have delivered together.
Yes, I stand in the middle of the...
Yeah, senior figures in the European Parliament saying that they could probably live with this deal, but they need to see the legal text. But they're not going to ratify it until they see whether the UK House of Commons ratifies it on Saturday. And similarly here with the European Council, the leaders will nod it through probably today because they've been kept in the loop throughout, but they're not going to ratify it until some way down the line. And there is an important issue in that, Matthew, because we're talking about a couple of weeks now. Of course, Boris Johnson doesn't want an extension. Politically, that's damaging for him. He wants this done and dusted by October the 31st, keeping to that pledge that he's set out. If the European Parliament or the European Council were to drag their feet, then it starts to get messy because you need technical extensions and that sort of thing. And obviously that opens the door to those who oppose the deal in the House of Commons as well.
All right, Christian, thanks very much. Christian Fraser there for us. Thank you to you and your team, and thanks to our team also in Westminster. Plenty more on all of that. That, of course, is dominating our programme. But let's turn to the situation in Syria as well, because that also a very important and moving story here today. As a snapshot, well, that picture over my shoulder tells you the story. Grim faces as Turkey's president met with the US Vice President. Mike Pence urged President Erdogan for an immediate end to their offensive in Syria. Turkey has repeatedly refused, saying they'll continue their operations against Kurdish forces until they've achieved their objectives. Now, also in the last hour, Syria's president said they would counter the Turkish invasion by all means possible. Throw into the mix the publication on Wednesday of that astonishing letter from President Trump that President Erdogan apparently threw into the bin, and lots to discuss here in just a moment. But first, let's hear from our Middle East editor, Jeremy Bowen, who sent this a short while ago from Ankara.
Feels a long way from this city, the Turkish capital Ankara, to the war in Syria and everything that's happening there. But President Erdogan of Turkey says that the people of this capital and of this country are going to be safer because of what he's ordered the Turkish army to do in Syria. The American delegation, led by Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo, flew into Ankara with a very clear brief from President Trump. He has threatened to destroy the Turkish economy if Turkey doesn't agree to a ceasefire in Syria. Now, it is doubtful that the American delegation is going to be able to achieve anything lasting with President Erdogan. The two sides' positions are way apart. It's hard to see what President Putin has wanted to be the puppet master in the Middle East. He may decide the time has come to become a peacemaker in the region. The deal.
Our Europe correspondent, but Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionists say they still can't support.
Well, let's talk for the next few minutes with Mark Lowen, the outgoing BBC Turkey correspondent, and from Washington, our correspondent there. That meeting, I mean, all the atmospherics, terrible, grim faces with the handshakes. There is very, very little chance of a ceasefire, isn't there?
There is for the moment, Matthew, and certainly in the light of that astonishing letter which you referenced, President Erdogan is not going to want to be seen to be backing down, having received this astonishing letter, saying, don't be a tough guy, don't be a fool. History will look upon you forever as the devil if good things don't happen. I mean, he can't be seen publicly to give in. On top of that, there is the fact that this operation has got a lot of broad nationalist support in Turkey. Not only Erdogan backers are supporting this, but also nationalists on the other side, for whom bashing the Kurdish militants is something that draws together all political stripes in Turkey. So, there's very little sign that he's back. President Erdogan is somebody who tends to dig in his heels when he feels under pressure. And as Jeremy said there, the only way, really, I think, that that President Erdogan could feel the pressure to pull back is possibly coming from Russia, not from the US.
I'll come to that point a little later, but we've had 9 days of bombardment, of fighting on the ground there in northeastern Syria. We had that news from Syria's President Assad only an hour or so ago that Syria plans to counter this Turkish invasion by all legitimate means. That was the quote from him. So potentially yet another new flank opening up.
And another new flashpoint. I mean, there could be potentially a direct confrontation between Assad forces, who have been able to fill that vacuum as the Kurds have withdrawn from northern Syria and gone into parts of northern Syria from which they've been absent since 2012. Could they enter into a direct military confrontation with Turkish troops? Again, maybe that's a way of putting pressure on President Erdogan to pull back Turkish troops if there is the real possibility of a direct military clash. But really, Matthew, I can't think of a moment of a foreign policy decision in Syria's war over the last 8 years that has had quite the ramifications that Turkey's move has in the last 9 days.
Let's bring in Chris Buckler there in Washington. Chris, we'll talk about the Pence-Erdogan meeting in a moment or two. We'll also talk about Nancy Pelosi, who's just been speaking in the last little while. But I wanted to start with that extraordinary letter that we saw published on Wednesday from President Trump. I mean, a lot of people looking at that initially thought perhaps it wasn't real, but it was indeed genuine. I mean, what are people making of that there?
Yeah, and of course it was released a week after it was sent to President Erdogan, and in some ways it was attempting to show that the White House was doing something to put pressure on President Erdogan, because we just had a news conference from President Trump in which he looked
the final say in another referendum.
As it stands, we cannot support this deal and will oppose it in Parliament on Saturday, and it also is unclear if he has the support.
Good deal. We don't want to be responsible for slaughtering thousands of people, and I don't want to be responsible for destroying the Turkish economy, and I will. And he later goes on to say that history will look upon you favourably if you get you later. Now, there hasn't been a call, but there has been this meeting now between Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo. The truth is it lasted perhaps longer than some people expected, more than an hour. But their hands were always tied by the idea that President Trump is saying that as far as he's concerned, he doesn't want American troops there, he doesn't want any part of this. And in fact, even some Republicans, like the staunch Trump loyalist Lindsey Graham, have been saying that as far as he's concerned, he has undercut their ability to end this conflict.
Chris, I mentioned Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, a moment ago. She's been speaking, giving a news conference for the last little while, talking about that decision to pull out US troops and the possibility of Russia filling the void. I just want to play a key bit from that news conference.
I also pointed out to the President I had concerns that the L road seemed to lead to Putin. The Russians have been trying to get a foothold in the Middle East for a very long time unsuccessfully. And now the president has given them an opportunity with the Kurds reaching out to them for support in Syria. They have the Russians were the beneficiaries of any withholding of assistance or encouragement to the Ukraine. Again, Putin benefits.
Chris, let me bring you back in. I mean, it looks like this effort to get a ceasefire is going to be rebuffed. What is the White House plan after that?
Yeah, I don't think there is a plan. And I think, truthfully, the administration has been searching for a strategy to try to say, listen, we are taking some efforts to sort this problem out. But the truth is if President Trump is saying he doesn't want any part of that, it leaves his officials somewhat tied into what they can do. Saying that, inside Congress, you have both Democrats and Republicans saying very strongly that America should be doing more. And there is a real concern about this now essentially being a carve-up between Russia and Turkey, with Assad involved in this as well. And the Kurds, who were American allies in that battle against IS, essentially being the losers in all of this. And there are many people who feel that there is a responsibility there to try to ensure that the Kurds are looked after in all of this. It is a very difficult situation that really the Americans don't know how to handle at this moment.
Quick final thought from Mark Lowen, who's here with me, and of course all the while there is fighting on the ground, but I wonder if the scenario that we may see play out, Jeremy Bowen touched on it, Nancy Pelosi touching upon it, that Turkey will actually, and President Erdogan will meet Vladimir Putin, I think it's at the end of next week. Perhaps that gives him enough time to make gains on the ground and then perhaps go for a ceasefire. And the White House then doesn't actually have to do very much.
Yeah, but I mean, just imagine how that's going to make the US look, that actually the second largest army in NATO has responded to Russian pressure rather than American pressure. I mean, Turkey's relationship with the West has been further poisoned over the last 9 days. The relationship with the US is at an all-time low. There have been these American sanctions put on Turkey. If President Erdogan now caves to Vladimir Putin rather than Donald Trump, it is going to look very, very bad for NATO and for the West, which desperately needs Turkey. And also, of course, just to touch on that point that you just said, Matthew, about the civilians on the casualties on the ground, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a watchdog based here in the UK, has said that 300,000 more people have been displaced in these 9 days of fighting, and 500 people have been killed. So disastrous impact over the last 9 days.
All right, Mark Lowen, thanks very much. And to Chris Buckler in Washington, thanks also for joining us. Just a quick postscript, because we are expected to hear from Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo in Ankara. So just as soon as those pictures and the feed of that news conference comes in, we'll bring that to you. Now, you're watching BBC World News. Still to come on the programme, NASA is getting ready for its first ever all-female spacewalk. We'll talk to a woman who's taken part in 4 spacewalks herself. That's coming up.
However, the DUP, whose votes could be crucial in getting
making every journey personal. Singapore Airlines, a great way to fly.
The world needs to know Brazil by Brazil. One of the largest agricultural producers in the world, Brazil feeds 1.2 billion people and uses only 7.8% of its land for farming. Brazil is one of the main exporters of sugarcane, coffee beans, orange juice, soy, beef, and chicken. This is only possible through technology, agricultural research, and incentives for production, which will amount to $53 billion this year. Meet a new Brazil, modern and productive. Meet Brazil by Brazil.
1, 2. Be there, on the edge of your chair, for an event without precedent, the pinnacle of human achievement. Be there to see the alliance of art, music, fashion, and science. See a futuristic festival filled with ideas new and radical. Performances magical in a 6-month-long spectacle. This you can't afford to miss. It's the best of humankind in the greatest show of our time.
We've now reached the knockout phase of the Rugby World Cup. Who is going to lift the William Webberless Trophy come November the 2nd in Yokohama? You can find out on BBC World News or at the website bbc.com/sport or on mobile or tablet by downloading the BBC Sport app.
Democratic Unionists say they still can't support it as things stand.
Welcome back to the programme. Let's take a look at a couple of the other stories making the headlines today, because opposition lawmakers in Hong Kong have disrupted proceedings at the Legislative Council for a second successive day. The territory's chief executive, Carrie Lam, had to be escorted to safety after some pro-democracy politicians started to shout and wave placards. Police in Barcelona say they were attacked with petrol bombs and acid during a third night of violent separatist protests. More than 20 people were arrested. It follows the jailing of 9 Catalan leaders over the failed attempt to break away from Spain in 2017. Meanwhile, the pro-independent leader of Catalonia has proposed a new referendum by the end of 2021. And the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge have been playing cricket during the latest stage of their tour of Pakistan. The British royal couple took turns batting softballs at the National Cricket Academy in Lahore. Now let's turn to space, because NASA is hoping tomorrow will mark one giant leap for women when the first all-female spacewalk is due to take place. Christina Koch and Jessica Meyer are due to head outside the International Space Station on Friday to replace a battery. Now, 15 women have taken part in spacewalks before, but until now they've always been accompanied by men. Well, here's one of the astronauts on why she thinks the milestone is actually worth marking.
I do think it's important, and I think it's important because of the historical nature of what we're doing, and that in the past women haven't always been at the table, and it's wonderful to be contributing to the human spaceflight program at a time when all contributions are being accepted, when everyone has a role, and that can lead in turn to increased chance for success.
Well, one woman who's taken part in a spacewalk before is Dr. Linda Godwin. She spent a total of 38 days in space. She's a professor of physics and astronomy at the University of Missouri now and joins me live from Houston. Welcome here to the programme. It is interesting because I was looking at the facts and figures. The first female cosmonaut did a spacewalk 35 years ago. So to mark this moment in 2019, what do you think?
It has to be marked. I agree with the prior comments. It's kind of like, why didn't this happen before? And you want it to be a non-event, right? Because there should be much more comment, but it is important to mark that finally this is occurring after all these years that we have 2 women going out from the International Space Station.
I mentioned there that you spent all of those days in space. You did 4 spacewalks. Tell me what it was like.
And I have to say I did 2 spacewalks, but I love, hearing that it could have been 4. It is unique, and I got to do those on a couple of different missions, and mine were out of the space shuttle airlock. Of course, these will be conducted out of the International Space Station. But that first time you go out, opening the hatch, and it's like, what is it going to be like? And our training on Earth really prepares us well for that. And I found myself mainly concentrating on the focus of getting the job done, there's a lot riding on your shoulders, so to speak, doing these spacewalks.
What are the risks? What are the risks and the difficulties?
Well, the suit, of course, has to work very well, and I had high confidence in the suit, so we have to count on it to provide our pressure to survive, air to breathe, cooling. The communication needs to work right. There's some small worry about micrometeoroid debris, but there's multi-layers of the suit to protect against that. There's keeping oneself tethered always to structure. So there's a lot to wrap your head around, but that's what we train for.
You talked about the suit. It's interesting. Only yesterday we were sharing pictures on this programme, and I think we're going to put them on again because NASA were unveiling, and the pictures are running here as you're speaking to us, that the new suit that they hope for that mission to the moon in 2024. I mean, how much of a difference does what you're wearing actually make to what you can actually do?
It makes a big difference, and I've only seen those photos myself that you just referenced, and it looks like they're accommodating a lot more difference in sizes. And what's really important is that you're in as small a fit as possible so that it matches your own body joints, because you can imagine if the shoulder joint of the suit hits down your arm, that can cut off inches of reach. So it needs to match your waist motion, it needs to match your shoulder joints. And just in general, you're the more you want to be snug, but not too snug, because you gotta survive in it. But it needs to fit around you as much as possible and match your own body anatomy. And so I think that's where we're going a little bit better with the next generation.
Doctor, we've run out of time, but thank you for your time and joining us on today's programme.
Thank you.
Here in a moment or two, we'll get all the latest headlines. Hugh Edwards is live for us in Brussels, the latest on those big developments there in those talks, a deal. So that's coming up in a moment or two. Don't go away.
Unionists say they still can't support it as things stand.
Japan is where one of the world's greatest natural events occurs. People from all over the world come together, exploring the sakura. It's as if heaven comes down to earth. What I saw, what I felt under the cherry blossoms was a dream come true. Enjoy my Japan.
The latest tech is advancing so fast it can be